Salt Lake City woke to a dry chill and patches of old snow clinging to the edges of the runway. At Gate 14, passengers moved in quiet, pre-coffee procession, wheeling carry-ons and clutching paper boarding passes. Flight Western Skies 3117 was boarding soon. Destination: Chicago. At the back of the line, hardly anyone noticed the woman with the slow, steady gait. She wore a deep charcoal coat and carried a worn leather shoulder bag that had seen better decades. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't scrolling her phone like everyone else. Her eyes, calm and deliberate, scanned the departure board above. Her name was Judge Evelyn Monroe, 63 years old, federal judge for the Northern District of Illinois. She had just finished giving a keynote at a regional judicial conference titled Justice in Divided Times, and now she was headed home. Home to her quiet condo on Chicago's north side. No cameras, no policy talk, no standing ovations. Just silence. She dressed simply, no pearls, no heels, just a high-neck sweater, dark slacks, flat shoes. Her silver hair was pinned back in a soft twist, and her reading glasses sat low on her nose. To the casual observer, she could have been a retired librarian, or maybe a grandmother visiting her kids. The agent at the gate called priority boarding. Evelyn stepped forward, handed over her printed ticket. Seat 2A, first class, and nodded as the agent smiled and waved her through. The first-class cabin was small, quiet. Blue leather seats, brushed wood panels, warm lighting overhead. She found her seat by the window and placed her bag beneath the seat in front. From it, she pulled a weathered paperback novel and folded her coat across her lap. She didn't glance around, didn't engage. She opened to a page marked with an old receipt and began to read. It was The Known World, a book she had once quoted in a ruling on land rights for black families in rural Kentucky. The cabin slowly filled. A white man in a navy blazer took the aisle seat next to her. He glanced once in her direction, then buried his face in his phone. Evelyn didn't notice, or if she did, she didn't react. Then came the sharp click of heels. A tall woman appeared at the front of the cabin, blonde hair pinned neatly, clipboard in hand. Her name tag read, Susan Hartley. Susan moved down the aisle, scanning her list. When she reached row 2, she paused. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her tone polite but clipped. "May I see your boarding pass?" Evelyn looked up, a bit surprised. "Certainly," she replied, her voice calm and even. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out the paper ticket, and handed it over. Susan glanced at it, then at Evelyn, then again at the seat number. "This is a first-class seat," she said, her smile faltering slightly. "I'm aware," Evelyn answered softly. Susan tilted her head. "Are you traveling alone?" "Ahem." Susan handed the ticket back, but she didn't move away. Instead, she leaned in just slightly, lowering her voice. "There may have been a mix-up," she said. "This section is for premium customers only. I'll need you to come with me so we can sort this out." Evelyn blinked, unbothered. "There's no mix-up. That's my assigned seat." Susan didn't retreat. Her hand lightly touched the edge of the seat in a subtle show of authority, one Evelyn recognized all too well from years on the bench. No shouting, no force, just that quiet air of presumed control. "I'm going to ask you to move to the back," she said. "We can straighten this out after takeoff." The man in 2B looked over briefly, then back down at his phone. Evelyn closed her book. She didn't sigh, she didn't frown. She simply folded the receipt between the pages, slid it into her bag, and stood. Susan stepped aside. There was no argument, no drama, just a quiet, deliberate surrender of space. As Evelyn walked down the aisle toward economy, a few passengers glanced up. Most looked away quickly. She heard a woman murmur to her companion around row 5. "Poor thing, probably got on the wrong flight." Still, Evelyn didn't flinch. She only gripped her bag strap a little tighter. The economy was cramped, the overhead bins already overflowing. She found an empty window seat in the back third of the plane. She sat, carefully adjusted her bag, and placed her hands on her lap. She didn't cry. She didn't stew. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and opened a secure internal app, a judiciary communication tool most people didn't even know existed. Her thumbs moved slowly. Susan Hartley, Gate 14, Flight WS 3117. Unauthorized displacement, verified. Referred. She tapped send. Then she placed the phone face down in her lap and waited. The hum of the cabin was low but constant, like the background noise of a room trying to pretend nothing had just happened. Somewhere ahead, a baby let out a half-hearted cry before its mother hushed it with a soft shushing sound. The overhead bins thudded closed. Flight attendants moved briskly down the aisle, checking seatbelts, smiling, performing the ballet of pre-flight routine. Evelyn Monroe sat in her new seat 33F, back row window, and watched the runway disappear in the reflection of the small oval pane. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, fingers loosely interlocked. Her breathing was steady. To anyone passing by, she looked like just another passenger, maybe a little older, maybe a little tired, but otherwise unremarkable. Inside, there was a stillness. It wasn't numbness, it wasn't anger either, not yet. It was more like a precise kind of silence, the kind forged in decades of listening to people lie under oath, of sitting through hours of testimony without letting your face move, of weighing life-altering decisions and never letting your heart rush ahead of your reason. That's what this moment required. Not volume, not confrontation. Rhythmic breathing, discontrol. She glanced down at her phone again. The screen had gone dark, but the message had been sent, that much was certain. She hadn't expected a reply. Evelyn rarely waited for permission to act. And besides, the person receiving that message knew exactly what it meant. She slid the phone into the inside pocket of her coat and leaned back in her seat. The fabric was scratchier than first class, the cushion thinner. Her knees almost touched the seat in front of her. She didn't mind. The discomfort didn't come from the seat. It came from the way Susan Hartley had looked at her, not with malice, but with a kind of trained doubt, like someone seeing a math problem where the numbers didn't add up. Black woman, worn leather bag, gray coat, seat 2A. Something in her eyes didn't compute. Evelyn had seen that look before. In courtrooms, sure, but also in restaurants, lobbies, hotels, even walking through security lines at federal buildings where her ID still said United States District Court. It never came with slurs, it came with extra questions, with hesitations, with the small, sharp cuts that didn't bleed on the outside but made you wince all the same. And yet, Evelyn had never argued with it. That wasn't her way. People expected loud resistance, anger, raised voices, maybe even tears. What they never expected was someone who simply refused to react. That was her power. She turned to look out the window again. The airport apron was quiet. Baggage carts rolled past in the distance. A ground crew worker waved toward the jet bridge. A sense of time slipping sideways began to settle over the cabin, as it often did in those odd minutes between boarding and takeoff. A shadow passed by her aisle. Another flight attendant, this one younger, black with warm brown eyes, paused briefly as she passed by. "Ma'am, do you need anything?" she asked softly. Evelyn met her gaze. There was no pity in it, just awareness. "No," Evelyn said, her voice calm. "I'm fine." The attendant nodded once and continued down the aisle. That brief exchange, 2 seconds, no more, settled something in her chest. Just a little. Enough to remind her she wasn't entirely invisible. Up in the first-class cabin, Susan Hartley poured sparkling water for a businessman in 1C who hadn't noticed, or pretended not to notice, what had just transpired. She wore the same smile, said the same lines, but her clipboard was missing now. And so was the certainty in her step. She hadn't verified the manifest again. She hadn't needed to. The woman was gone after all. Issue resolved. Except, of course, it wasn't. Susan could feel it. The silence that had followed Judge Monroe down the aisle wasn't natural. It was the kind of silence that holds shape, like smoke in still air. She brushed the thought aside, adjusting a stack of napkins at the galley. In row 33. Evelyn reached into her bag again, not for her phone this time, but for the book she'd started reading. She turned a page but didn't really see the words. Instead, she thought of her father. Not because he had experienced moments like this, though he had, but because of how he'd handled them. Don't match their energy, he used to say. Match their discipline. That's how we win. He'd taught high school chemistry for 38 years in Montgomery, Alabama. Never raised his voice in class. Never needed to. When someone talked over him, he'd pause. When they assumed he was the janitor, he'd just smile and ask, "What do you need cleaned?" Evelyn had inherited that. Not just the quiet, but the steel beneath it. The plane lurched slightly as the door closed and the cabin crew began their final checks. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Good morning, folks. Welcome aboard Western Skies Flight 3117 with service to Chicago O'Hare. We're expecting smooth skies ahead and a quick flight time of just under 3 hours. Sit back, relax, and we'll be on our way shortly." Click. People adjusted their belts, flight attendants walked the aisles, trays were secured, books were opened, noise-canceling headphones went on, but Evelyn didn't move. She didn't reach for her drink, she didn't smile, she didn't nod. She sat there, perfectly still, not stubborn, just centered. And if anyone in the cabin had looked closely, they would have seen what Susan Hartley had missed. The kind of silence that doesn't mean surrender. The kind that warned you, something's coming. Susan Hartley had been flying for 15 years. 15 years of early mornings and delayed connections. 15 years of turbulence, cranky passengers, lost luggage, and a smile she kept polished like the metal wings on her blazer. She wasn't new, she wasn't inexperienced. She was what the airline called reliable. Clocked in, got the job done, never late, never called out, knew how to make a Bloody Mary without checking the bottle twice. And she knew how to read people. At least, that's what she liked to believe. From the moment she spotted the woman in 2A that morning, something had felt off. The woman didn't look like the usual first-class crowd. Not that Susan would have said it out loud. But there were patterns, expectations, a rhythm you learned from years in the air. Business travelers, retired executives, polished leisure types, and yes, sometimes a uniformed soldier or a VIP guest. But this woman, she looked ordinary. Plain gray coat, no designer labels, worn shoes, an old leather bag, not a carry-on roller like the others, just something you might find at a thrift store. She didn't carry herself like someone accustomed to first class. She carried herself like someone passing through. So Susan did what came naturally. She asked to see the boarding pass. And even after it matched the seat number, even after the woman calmly stated that it was correct, Susan couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. So she pushed. Not aggressively, not rudely. She never raised her voice. She kept her hands where they belonged. Just a gentle nudge, figuratively and literally. Enough to encourage movement, to restore the natural order of things. That's how Susan thought of it. She didn't hate the woman. She didn't even feel annoyed. It was just about fit, about maintaining standards, about making sure that first class stayed the way it was supposed to be. But now, as she moved through the cabin offering drinks and settling bags, something else had settled over her. Unease. She kept flashing back to the moment the woman stood up. There had been no resistance, no attitude, just a steady, piercing calm. And somehow, that silence had said more than any shouting ever could. Susan hated that kind of silence. It clung to her like static. A few rows back, in the rear galley, Emily Carter, one of the junior flight attendants, was prepping the beverage cart. She was new to the job, still figuring out when to smile and when to step back. But even she had noticed the tension earlier. She glanced toward the front where Susan moved briskly from row to row. Her gait was quick, controlled. But her shoulders were a little too tight. Her eyes moved a little too fast. Emily knew that look. It was the look of someone pretending everything was fine. She turned to James, another crew member, and murmured, "Was that seat situation earlier normal?" James shrugged, loading stir sticks into a tray. "Susan gets like that sometimes," he said under his breath. "She's by the book, unless the book doesn't match her instincts." Emily frowned. Her instincts? James didn't answer. He just gave her a look. The kind that said, "Don't push this one if you want your training to go smoothly." Back in the first-class galley, Susan straightened napkins that didn't need straightening. She checked the ice bin for the third time. She refolded 2 already perfect blankets. But nothing felt settled. She hated when things slipped out of routine. It made her feel exposed. And the woman, whoever she was, had definitely disrupted the routine. Not by causing a scene, not by arguing, but by not reacting. That's what gnawed at Susan the most. 2 months ago, she'd had a similar moment. A young man in first class, hoodie pulled up, sneakers instead of loafers. He'd had a valid ticket too. She hadn't said anything that time, just asked a few too many questions. He'd taken out his phone, recorded the whole thing, posted it online. She'd been called into HR, told to refresh her training, complete a sensitivity module. It had blown over. Kind of. But ever since then, she had felt like she was walking on thin ice. One wrong step, one viral clip, one accusation, and the wings she'd worn for 15 years could be gone in an instant. So when she saw the woman in 2A this morning, it wasn't just instinct. It was fear, dressed up as protocol. And now that fear was back, tapping at her shoulder again. She tried to shake it off. She had checked the ticket. The manifest didn't list the woman's name under first class. It probably was a booking error. She was trying to maintain order. That was her job. Keep the flight smooth, keep people where they belonged. Still, the words kept echoing in her mind. "This is my assigned seat." So calm, so certain, not defensive, not confused, not afraid. People didn't speak like that unless they knew something, unless they had power, real power. And Susan had the sinking feeling that she'd misjudged more than a seat assignment. In the back of the plane, Evelyn remained seated, unmoved. She hadn't touched her book again. Instead, she watched the way the sunlight crept along the edge of the window. Her hands were folded, her eyes calm. But beneath that stillness, a slow current of awareness moved. She could feel the shift happening. She didn't need to look at Susan to know she was uneasy. People like Susan always showed their discomfort eventually. They tightened their smiles, they busied their hands, they avoided certain rows. And Evelyn knew this. Power makes people nervous when they don't know it's there. She'd spent a lifetime walking into rooms where she wasn't expected to belong. Boardrooms, hotel lobbies, first-class cabins. She never needed to prove herself with volume. just with presence. And presence didn't need permission. Susan moved down the aisle again, slower this time. A few passengers glanced up. One woman shifted in her seat. A man pulled his baseball cap lower. The atmosphere wasn't exactly tense, but it wasn't relaxed either. Something had changed. And the thing was, it hadn't changed because of shouting. It had changed because of a look, a silence, a decision. Susan caught Emily watching her. Their eyes met for a split second. Emily looked away. Susan did too. The cabin seemed colder, somehow. Up in the cockpit, the pilot adjusted his headset. The in-flight phone buzzed softly beside him. He reached for it. The cabin was sealed. The door had closed with a firm hiss, and the click of locking mechanisms echoed faintly down the aisle. Overhead bins were shut, and the safety video began to play quietly on the embedded screens. Passengers were settling in for what they assumed would be an uneventful morning flight. Evelyn Monroe didn't move. She sat, in 33F, posture straight, seatbelt buckled, gaze fixed calmly on the window. The engine hadn't started yet. There was still time. She didn't know exactly what would happen, but she knew something would. She had made sure of it. Up in the first-class galley, Susan Hartley stood with her arms crossed loosely in front of her, watching the safety demo like it was the first time she'd ever seen it. In reality, she wasn't watching anything. Her mind was elsewhere. Replaying for the 5th time the way the woman in 2A had looked at her. Not with rage, not with confusion, with certainty. That unnerved her more than anger ever could. 3 rows behind Susan, a man in a gray blazer adjusted his laptop on the tray in front of him. He had barely glanced up when the earlier incident occurred. Like many passengers, he had chosen indifference over involvement. But now he kept stealing small glances up the aisle. Something felt off. Then it happened. The intercom beeped once, and the captain's voice came on. Calm, clipped. "Miss Hartley, please report to the cockpit." Susan froze for half a second, just enough to be noticeable. The other flight attendants turned toward her. One of them, James, raised his eyebrows but said nothing. Susan gave a brief, polite smile and stepped toward the cockpit. The curtain separating first class from the rest of the cabin swayed behind her as she disappeared from view. The moment she entered the cockpit, the door clicked shut behind her. Evelyn didn't need to see it to know it had started. She inhaled deeply, slow and even, and folded her hands again in her lap. A passenger across the aisle noticed the change in her demeanor, the way her shoulders shifted just slightly, like someone who'd finished a long breath underwater and finally reached the surface. Inside the cockpit, Captain Darnell glanced at her, then tapped a clipboard. "Do you recall the passenger in 2A earlier?" he asked. Susan nodded cautiously. "Yes, there was a mix-up with her seat." "You verified the mix-up?" he asked. "I looked at the manifest. Her name wasn't listed under first class," Susan replied, a little too quickly. "You verified her ticket?" I glanced at it. "But it matched the seat?" Susan hesitated. "Yes, but she didn't look." She stopped herself. "She didn't look." Susan's mouth went dry. "She didn't appear to fit the profile of our typical premium traveler." Captain Darnell blinked slowly, then leaned forward, elbows on the control panel. "That passenger," he said, "is Judge Evelyn Monroe, federal judge, Northern District of Illinois, currently presiding over a federal investigation involving 3 major defense contractors, one of which happens to own 18% of this airline's parent company." Susan swallowed hard. The captain continued, "And she just sent a direct referral through judiciary channels, citing unauthorized displacement." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. But each word landed like a small hammer. I've been advised by corporate legal to de-escalate immediately. We are returning to gate while FAA oversight is contacted." "We haven't taken off," Susan whispered, stunned. "No," the captain said. "And we won't. Not until this is handled." Then he turned away. "You'll go back to her, publicly. You'll apologize, and you'll offer to escort her back to first class." Susan stood there, frozen. The cockpit was small, but suddenly it felt like a courtroom, and she was no longer the one in control. When she emerged from the cockpit, the change in her was visible. Her posture was rigid, her lips pressed into a tight line. The curtain fell behind her with a whisper, and all at once, the eyes of the first-class cabin were on her. Even those who hadn't noticed anything earlier sensed something now. The air had changed. She began the long walk down the aisle. Her heels, once so confident, now tapped against the floor like a slow metronome, counting down. Passengers in business class paused their screens. Some leaned slightly to the side, instinctively tracking her progress. A young couple whispered to one another, craning their necks as she passed. Susan reached row 33. There she was. The woman she had dismissed an hour ago, now seated upright, calm as ever, a quiet storm in civilian clothing. "Judge Monroe," she said, lowering her voice. Evelyn turned her head slowly. "Yes?" Susan crouched slightly, enough to meet her eye level. "It appears there was a mistake. I would like to escort you back to your assigned seat in first class." The words were rehearsed, thin, barely held together. Evelyn didn't blink. "A mistake?" Susan nodded quickly. "Your name wasn't displaying properly on our cabin manifest, but it's been clarified." Evelyn held her gaze. "I see." She picked up her bag slowly. There was no rush, no urgency. She stood with the poise of someone not returning to a seat, but reclaiming something that had always been hers. Before walking forward, she turned to Susan and added, quietly but clearly, "You said I didn't belong there." Susan's face tightened. "I didn't mean. You touched me." Evelyn continued, not angry, not loud, just firm. A man across the aisle stopped mid-sip of his coffee. Susan drew in a shallow breath. "It was a light gesture. I didn't—" Evelyn said nothing else. She turned and began the walk back to the front of the plane, and every eye followed her. Every row she passed turned quiet. Some passengers looked down, others shifted uncomfortably. The man from 2B, who'd said nothing earlier, straightened in his seat and stared at the floor. Susan trailed behind her, carrying nothing. For the first time in 15 years, she had no words. The aisle stretched ahead like a quiet corridor, longer than it had seemed when Evelyn Monroe first walked down it an hour ago. But this time, it wasn't just space she moved through. It was attention. Every seat she passed carried someone watching. Some watched directly, others peeked with the corners of their eyes, pretending to be lost in their phones or magazines. But nobody could ignore what they'd just witnessed. A woman quietly humiliated, then silently restored. Not by force, not by confrontation, but by a presence they didn't expect to matter. And now that she was walking back, the weight of that silence sat on each passenger like an invisible hand pressing into their shoulders. No one had said a word when she was removed. Not when she was questioned. Not when she was asked to move. Not when she was touched. And now? Now it was too late to pretend nothing had happened. The businessman in 2B, still seated beside her original spot, shifted uncomfortably as Evelyn approached. She glanced at him once, not coldly, not accusingly, just long enough to acknowledge him. That one look made his chest tighten. He stood slightly to let her in. "Welcome back," he muttered. She gave a slight nod. "Thank you." It wasn't gratitude. It was acknowledgement. He sat again, fiddling with his seatbelt, the tray table, his phone, anything to keep from meeting her eyes again. Susan Hartley, still standing 2 rows behind, looked like she was waiting for instructions that wouldn't come. The apology had been delivered, the gesture had been made, but the air wasn't cleared. It had thickened. She turned and quietly walked back toward the galley, her footsteps no longer crisp. The confidence she wore earlier had peeled away in layers. She passed 2 passengers who had watched the entire interaction without blinking. One of them, a woman in her 50s, glanced at her briefly, then shook her head once and turned away. That hit harder than words. Back in seat 2A, Evelyn settled in again. She folded her coat neatly across her lap and returned her bag beneath the seat. Nothing dramatic, no big gestures. The same way she had done the first time. Except this time, the cabin noticed. The man across the aisle in 2C, late 60s, well-dressed, with a subtle lapel pin marking some military service long past, cleared his throat. "I saw what happened earlier," he said, his voice low, trying not to attract attention. "That was unfortunate." Evelyn turned to him, expression unreadable. "Unfortunate?" He paused. "I mean, clearly a misunderstanding. I'm sure she didn't mean anything by it." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "Did you say anything when it happened?" He hesitated. "Well, I didn't think it was my place, exactly." Evelyn nodded. "Once." "I see." And just like that, she turned back toward the window. He didn't say another word. In the galley, Susan leaned against the narrow counter, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped a stack of napkins that didn't need adjusting. Emily Carter entered behind her, checking the inventory list quietly. She paused, noticing the look on Susan's face. "You okay?" Emily asked, her voice careful. Susan nodded too quickly. "Yes, fine." Emily didn't push, but she lingered. Finally, she said, "Was her ticket really incorrect?" Susan didn't answer right away. She didn't seem like she belonged there," she said, almost in a whisper. "I didn't want to take chances. We've had people sneak up front before." Emily frowned. "But she had the seat, didn't she? And a federal ID?" Susan stared down at her hands. "I didn't look closely enough," she admitted. Emily didn't say that's a problem. She didn't say, "You messed up." She just stood there for a moment and said, "It didn't look good." Susan nodded slowly. "No," she said, "it didn't." Back in 2A, Evelyn wasn't reading her book. It was open in her lap, but her mind was elsewhere. The cabin felt quieter now, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that comes after an alarm has gone off and people are pretending not to have heard it. She could feel it in the way the flight attendants walked, in the stiffness of passengers' movements, in the way drinks were accepted without eye contact. No one knew what to say, so they said nothing. But silence isn't neutral. It tells its own story. It says, "I saw you pushed, and I didn't stand up." It says, "I heard what she said, and I did." It says, "I didn't think it was my business until I realized who you were." That last one stung the most. Her phone buzzed softly in her coat pocket. She pulled it out discreetly, shielding the screen from others. Message from Dad. "They've confirmed everything. Stay seated. FAA is escalating. No further action needed from you. I'll handle the rest." She smiled faintly. Not because she felt vindicated, but because the system she had helped uphold was, in this moment, finally holding itself accountable. She didn't reply. There was nothing to say. At a row behind her, a young woman whispered to her partner, "Do you think she's someone important?" "I think," he whispered back, "someone messed with the wrong one." 35,000 feet above the ground, Evelyn Monroe stared out at the horizon line, calm and steady. The reckoning had started, but not through yelling, not through confrontation. It had started with a woman being removed for the way she looked, and it was unfolding because no one could quite explain why. That question lingered in the cabin, unanswered and heavy. Why didn't we say anything? And in that silence, Evelyn sat, not small, not angry, not afraid, but unmistakably present. The plane was quiet again, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that came from peace. It was the kind that followed discomfort, the kind that filled a room or a cabin when people had seen too much and said too little. Evelyn Monroe sat in her original seat, 2A, just as composed as the moment she had first taken it, except now the entire energy around her had shifted. The passengers didn't speak to her, but they watched, subtly, carefully, cautiously, like the air itself was holding its breath, unsure of what might come next. She didn't look at them. Didn't need to. She had long since mastered the art of feeling a room without reacting to it. That was what being a judge demanded. Not the power to speak, but the discipline to remain still until it mattered most. She leaned back into her seat, tilted her head slightly toward the window, and closed her eyes. Not to sleep, but to think. There was a kind of ache that came with dignity. Most people didn't realize it. They assumed restraint meant peace, that if you didn't fight back, you must not be hurting. But that wasn't true. Evelyn wasn't unbothered. She was simply measured. There had been many moments in her life like this one, moments when she had to weigh whether speaking up was worth the cost, and in some of those moments, she had stayed quiet. Not because she lacked courage, but because she knew the world rarely listened to women like her, unless they were already bleeding or broken. So she had learned to make her silence speak louder. And today, it had. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. One new message. From Chief Justice Layton. Got your referral. Already in motion. Don't worry about protocol, it's covered. She smiled faintly. That was Layton, blunt, efficient. She had once mentored him during his clerkship, back when he was still wearing cheap ties and doubting every move he made. Now he sat at the head of the federal judiciary, and when Evelyn sent a quiet red flag report through internal channels, he acted on it without hesitation. She typed a simple reply. Thank you. No need for spotlight. Just follow through. That was her request. No press, no interviews, no dramatic apology statements. Just consequences. Consequences that meant something. Further up in the cockpit, the captain was speaking in low tones to a representative from FAA compliance via headset. The referral from Judge Monroe had triggered a review code, one that wasn't taken lightly. There were only a handful of positions in government where a single coded message could freeze a flight in place. Federal judge was one of them, especially one presiding over cases tied to contractors with defense or transport stakes. Especially one whose silence had carried more weight than a shouting match ever could. Back in the first-class galley, Susan Hartley stood motionless, staring at the small sink like it could offer answers. Her hands trembled as she opened a pack of plastic cups, each one crackling slightly under her touch. Emily Carter approached her again, this time more cautiously. They're saying we might not take off right away, she said quietly. Susan didn't respond. Emily waited. Then, carefully, she's not just a passenger, is she? Susan's jaw clenched. No, she's a federal judge. Emily exhaled slowly. That explains it. You didn't threaten me, Susan added as if needing to say it aloud. She didn't say a single angry word, just got up. Just looked at me. Russian tactics to prevent further use of the ship, But the pause between them said it all. Some people didn't need to yell to make things happen. Sometimes. The most dangerous person in the room was the one who didn't speak. A few rows behind Evelyn, a teenager, whispered to his mother, "What's a federal judge?" The mother leaned in, speaking low. "Someone who decides really important legal cases, like at the top of the system." "Is she famous?" "No," the mother said. "She's powerful. That's different." Evelyn tucked her phone back away. No more messages were needed. She had done what she needed to do. But inside, something had shifted. This wasn't the first time someone assumed she didn't belong. Wasn't the first time someone asked to see her ID twice, or assumed she was in the wrong line, or told her to try economy. But this time she'd had enough. Maybe it was age, maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was the slow buildup of 100 small humiliations, none of which made headlines, but all of which left scars. And so, this time, she'd acted, without raising her voice, without explaining herself, without asking for dignity, because dignity wasn't something to be begged for. It was something you carried, and sometimes you had to remind people it was never theirs to take. Across the aisle, the man in 2B still hadn't spoken again, but he kept glancing over, small, awkward glances filled with the weight of words unsaid. He knew what he should have done. He knew it when it happened. He knew it now. But the moment had passed, and silence had a longer shelf life than guilt. In the back of the cabin, a baby cried briefly, then stopped. Evelyn didn't flinch. She closed her eyes again, not out of weariness, but because now the wheel had been set in motion, and she didn't need to steer it anymore. This wasn't just about her. It was about the next person who might be judged by their coat, or their shoes, or their skin. It was about everyone who had been quietly ushered to the back without protest. For protest didn't need a voice. It had already traveled further than any shouting ever could. And it wasn't done yet. Captain James Darnell sat in the cockpit, his hands steady on the yoke, his gaze flickering between the altitude screen and the in-flight communication panel. Outside, the Utah mountains framed the edges of the tarmac with jagged calm. But inside, the air was taut, tight, with the weight of what had already happened and what was about to. The intercom chimed softly again. Another message from dispatch. "Hold at gate. FA observer en route. Do not proceed to taxi." He exhaled slowly, reached for the intercom button, and announced in his smooth, neutral voice, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been instructed to hold our position at the gate for a brief delay due to a technical protocol check. We appreciate your patience." He released the button and sat back. It wasn't a lie. Not technically, but technical protocol check didn't begin to cover what was happening. In the front cabin, some passengers looked up, others simply sighed, used to delays. A businessman in 1D checked his watch and muttered something about missing his connection in Denver, even though this flight wasn't going to Denver. But a few passengers glanced toward 2A, toward the woman who had moved, then returned, toward the one whose presence had, somehow, paused the entire plane. Evelyn didn't shift, didn't react. She sat still, her hands folded calmly in her lap, the seatbelt now secured. She didn't need to speak. She had already spoken. In the galley, Susan Hartley's body stiffened at the sound of the captain's voice. She caught only 3 words: "Hold our position." Her gut clenched. They weren't taking off. Not yet. That didn't just mean someone was watching. It meant someone was intervening. She moved robotically, picking up an untouched coffee cup from the counter and discarding it into the trash. Emily Carter glanced at her, then at the closed cockpit door. "Is this because of her?" she whispered. Susan didn't answer, but they both knew. Out on the jet bridge, a new figure approached. A tall black man in a dark blue FAA regulation jacket, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp behind clear glasses. His badge read, Armhazy Oversight, Officer. He wasn't smiling. He didn't need to. Behind him, 2 uniformed airline representatives followed, trying not to look nervous. The cabin door opened with a sharp hiss. Passengers near the front turned. They weren't sure what they were witnessing: maintenance, security, a surprise audit. But the presence of the man in the blue FAA jacket, flanked by corporate, said enough. Something was happening that wasn't normal. The man stepped into the aircraft slowly, scanning the space like a courtroom. When his eyes reached the first row, he locked briefly onto Evelyn Monroe. He didn't nod, didn't acknowledge her directly, but his posture shifted slightly, a signal only a few people in the world could read. And Evelyn? She saw it instantly. Recognition, respect, execution mode. "Good morning," Officer Hayes said calmly, his voice audible to the entire first-class cabin. "We've received a regulatory alert for oversight review. All crew, please remain in place." Lead flight attendant stepped forward. Silence. Susan Hartley felt every molecule in her limbs harden. Her feet moved before her mind caught up. She stepped out from behind the curtain, clipboard in hand like it could shield her. "I'm Susan Hartley," she said, trying to sound composed. "Ma'am," Officer Hayes replied, eyes neutral. "Step with me to the front galley." He didn't bark, he didn't threaten, but every passenger in rows 1 through 5 leaned just a little closer. In the galley, away from the seats, Hayes lowered his voice, but not too low. "We've received a formal conduct flag under Judicial Referral Code 117B, Passenger Monroe, Seat 2A. Susan tried to swallow, but her mouth was dry. "He was asked to move based on appearance," Hayes continued. "Manifest confirms her name was attached to 2A. Your own logs indicate her boarding pass was scanned properly." Susan opened her mouth. I'm not here for explanation," Hayes said sharply, without raising his voice. "I'm here for accountability." He turned toward the airline rep behind him. "Per federal protocol, I'm documenting this flight as non-compliant. Aircraft will not be cleared for taxi until statement is obtained and crew reassignment is considered." The rep went pale. "You're grounding the crew?" "Not the crew," Hayes replied. "The situation. And situations are shaped by choices." Susan stood frozen. In 15 years, she had never felt so thoroughly stripped of control. Back in 2A, Evelyn remained motionless. She didn't smirk, didn't gloat, but her fingers slowly brushed the edge of her coat, once, then settled. Across the aisle, 2B stared forward, eyes wide as if seeing her for the first time. Like maybe this wasn't just a woman who got her seat back. Maybe this was someone who could stop time without raising her voice. Emily Carter remained in the galley, eyes darting between Susan and Hayes. Then she did something small, but brave. She stepped forward and said, almost under her breath, "Sir, I witnessed the removal. I'd be willing to give a statement if needed." Hayes turned his eyes toward her. "And your name?" "Emily Carter, junior crew." He nodded once. "You'll be contacted." Susan didn't look at her. Emma didn't expect her to. The officer exited the plane, leaving the air pressurized with consequence. The door closed behind him, but the room hadn't released its breath. A few minutes passed. Then the captain's voice returned. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be pausing for an additional 20 minutes. Thank you for your continued patience." It was the voice of a man who knew the flight wasn't in his hands anymore. It was in hers. Evelyn exhaled quietly. The kind of breath you take when the weight hasn't lifted, but the balance has shifted. She didn't need to move the plane. She just needed to remind it who was sitting in 2A. Susan Hartley had never heard silence ring so loudly. The cabin was still, except for the occasional cough or shuffling of a sleeve. The safety video had long since finished. The flight attendants had nothing left to pretend to do. And the passengers? They weren't reading. They weren't scrolling. They were waiting, not for takeoff, but for something to land. And it was landing right on Susan. She stood near the forward galley, shoulders tight, back against the metal cart, eyes fixed ahead like she was staring through the wall. The door to the plane had closed again, but this time it wasn't to lift off. It was to seal the moment, and everyone knew it. From the cockpit, the captain's voice came again, clipped, polite, but just off enough that anyone paying attention could hear it wasn't a routine update. "Miss Hartley, please prepare the cabin for immediate inspection." There it was. Not departure, not arrival, inspection. Susan moved, stiffly, stepping back into the first-class cabin, but she didn't get far. A uniformed airport security officer stepped aboard from the jet bridge. Not a TSA agent. This one wore a blazer with a small silver DOJ pin and an FAA liaison badge on the lapel. Behind him stood David Larson, a senior executive from the airline's Customer Accountability and Crisis Division. The kind of man who never flew commercial unless something had gone terribly wrong. The kind of man whose appearance said one thing. This was no longer just an in-flight issue, this was a liability. Larson stepped into the aircraft with the ease of someone used to entering boardrooms after scandal. "Ms. Hartley?" he said, not asking, not waiting. Susan turned toward him. "Yes, sir." He didn't lower his voice. "Effective immediately, you are being removed from active duty for conduct review." Passengers turned, heads angled. This wasn't a whisper behind the curtain type of conversation anymore. "Please collect your personal items. You'll be escorted from the aircraft." Susan's lips parted slightly. "Sir, This is not a discussion," he replied firmly. "You'll be given the opportunity to respond formally, but not here. Not now." The security officer stepped forward, standing beside Larson. "Ma'am," he said, motioning toward the exit. Susan's hands began to shake. She turned toward the rear of the plane as if searching for something, perhaps for support, or for Emily, or for a reason this wasn't happening. But no one met her eyes. Not even Emily. Not anymore. She turned back, forcing composure onto her face like a mask she couldn't quite fasten. She retrieved her blazer from the galley hook, adjusted it mechanically, and began the walk of consequence down the aisle. This time, no heels clicking. Just slow, deliberate footsteps. As she passed the first few rows, someone tried to hide their phone, but clearly was recording. Others simply stared, unsure whether to look directly or to pretend they hadn't been complicit in silence. She passed Evelyn Monroe. Their eyes met, and in that gaze, Susan saw what she hadn't seen before. Not judgment. Not vengeance. Panuhi. Evelyn didn't smirk. Didn't speak. She didn't need to. Some punishments are handed down from a bench. Others arrived quietly in the aisle of a grounded plane. Susan exited the aircraft. The door hissed shut behind her with a finality that felt deeper than air pressure. It felt like a door closing on a version of herself she hadn't realized needed to be left behind. Inside the plane, the atmosphere shifted again. Not relaxed, not yet, but different. The woman in 2A was no longer just a passenger. She had become something else, an event, a reckoning, and slowly, that realization settled across the cabin like fog. The man in 2B cleared his throat. He had been silent for the better part of an hour, but now, something in him couldn't stay quiet. He leaned slightly toward Evelyn. "I should have said something earlier," he murmured. "I saw it. I didn't think it was my place." Evelyn looked at him. "I understand," she said softly, and then, "But silence is always a place." He nodded once, shame prickling his skin. Further back in economy, a woman nudged her teenage son and whispered, "You see that? That's why you never judge people by how they look." The boy nodded, wide-eyed, watching the ripple of consequence move through the cabin. In the galley, Emily Carter took a deep breath. She didn't feel triumphant, but she felt relieved. She had almost said nothing, almost chosen the safer path. But when she saw Susan escorted off, and Evelyn still seated with quiet dignity, she knew she'd done the right thing. And that meant something. Evelyn rested her head against the seat. The storm wasn't over. There would be interviews, investigations, maybe even noise in the media, depending on how far this traveled. But for now, she had nothing else to do. She had acted. She had remained calm. And the system, at least this time, had chosen to respond. Out on the tarmac, the sun shifted, reflecting off the tail fin of the aircraft, painting a pale arc of light across the window by seat 2A. Evelyn opened her eyes briefly. She saw it. She smiled, just slightly. Not because she'd won, but because they had seen. And that was more than most people like her ever got. By the time the plane finally pushed back from the gate, nearly 2 hours behind schedule, the cabin was no longer quiet in the way it had been earlier. It was quieter in the way churches are quiet after a confession. Still, heavy, but with something sacred in the air. Susan Hartley was gone, removed, escorted off the flight in full view of those she once moved past, with practiced smiles and clipped tones. Now, all that remained was the after. And the after was beginning to talk. In 24D, a middle-aged woman opened her phone and began typing. She didn't post often, but this one felt important. Just watched a black woman removed from first class and then escorted back like she didn't belong. An hour later, that same woman stayed seated while the airline removed the flight attendant instead. Turns out, she's a federal judge. I'll never forget the look on her face. Calm, steady, no yelling, just presence. She added a hashtag she hadn't used before. C2A. In 13B, a young man wearing headphones edited a short clip on his phone, just 15 seconds long. It showed Susan Hartley walking back up the aisle, stiff and pale, flanked by the airline exec and airport security. He didn't add music, he didn't add commentary. He didn't need to. The caption read, "This is what happens when you underestimate a black woman with power and patience." He tapped post. By the time they were airborne, it had already hit 100,000 views. Even the crew felt it. Emily Carter moved down the aisle now, with more presence. Not louder, not bolder, but clearer. She made eye contact. She said thank you, like it meant something. And when she reached row 2, she paused, ever so slightly. "Can I get you anything, ma'am?" she asked Evelyn Monroe. Evelyn looked up. "A glass of water, please, that's all." Emily nodded. "Right away." But she didn't walk off immediately. She hesitated, then leaned in just slightly. I saw what happened. I saw all of it. Evelyn's eyes met hers. "Thank you," she said. 2 words, nothing more. But Emily felt them land like a verdict. Somewhere over Nebraska, the plane hit a soft pocket of turbulence. Nothing serious. Just a few shudders to remind everyone they were high above the ground. But the ripple it caused wasn't fear. It was movement. His voice was settled. In row 14, An elderly white man spoke to the woman next to him. "I've been flying 40 years. I've never seen a flight stopped for that." The woman, younger, shook her head. "It wasn't stopped for that. It was stopped for what it represented." He tilted his head. She added, "That woman was judged before she was greeted, and for once the consequences didn't fall on her. That's rare." The man looked down, thoughtful. "Reminds me of something that happened to my daughter once," he murmured. "She never talked about it like that, though." "Maybe she didn't think anyone would listen," the woman said. And for a while, they sat quietly. By the time the beverage carts rolled through, a few more passengers had pulled out their phones. Not to scroll, but to share. Some wrote long captions. Others posted simple statements. "I watched justice unfold on Flight 3117. Seat 2A changed how I'll look at silence again." That woman didn't raise her voice, but she raised the bar. The cabin wasn't just full of people anymore. It was full of witnesses. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat still. She hadn't said much since takeoff. She hadn't opened her book. Her phone was on airplane mode, resting in the seat pocket in front of her. She wasn't tracking the posts or the hashtags or the surge that was beginning to take shape behind her, as she could feel it. Not as attention, but as traction. What started as humiliation had become momentum, and she had never left her seat. In 2B, the man beside her, quiet, conservative, the kind who normally preferred politics left out of airplanes, shifted again. He glanced at her. "May I say something?" he asked. Evelyn turned, waiting. "I hesitated earlier," he said. "When she asked for your ticket. When she told you to move. I wanted to say something, but I thought maybe you'd be fine. Or maybe I'd misunderstood." Evelyn listened. "I was wrong," he said. "And I'm sorry." She nodded once, then said something he didn't expect. "You're not the only one who's been silent too long." He looked down. She added, "But it's what you do after the silence that matters." As the plane began its descent into Chicago airspace, flight attendants moved efficiently through final checks. The cabin buzzed, not with the usual last-minute bag rustling or impatient seat shifting, but with a kind of shared awareness. People straightened their posture. People remembered what seat they were in. In the cockpit, the captain received one more message before final approach. This one wasn't from the airline. It was a priority-level notification from the FAA's Judicial Response Channel. The subject line, "Incident Report. Filed. Passenger Monroe. Evelyn. Priority? Observational." He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just glanced at the first officer and said, "Eyes sharp for landing. This one matters." Back in 2A, Evelyn looked out the window. The skyline of Chicago was cutting through a thin layer of clouds. The city looked familiar but new, like something had shifted, even if it hadn't physically moved. She knew what waited on the ground wouldn't be chaos. It would be a conversation, the kind that doesn't begin with a press release. One with passengers who saw what happened, and this time, they weren't going to forget. Not her. Not this. Not seat 2A. The plane had touched down at O'Hare nearly 40 minutes ago, but Judge Evelyn Monroe still hadn't left her seat. She remained in 2A, back straight, coat folded neatly across her lap. The seatbelt light was off. The seat in front of her was upright. Yet, she didn't move. Not because she was waiting, but because others were. Outside the aircraft, a cluster of people had gathered at Gate B-27. Not a mob, not the media, not yet, but quiet figures in navy suits, clipped name badges, and a posture that said, "We were told to show up. Now we're figuring out why." Among them stood two representatives from the Department of Transportation, one assistant to a state senator, and a senior liaison from the airline's Public Affairs Division. Behind them, a press aide from the Judiciary Accountability Committee whispered into her earpiece, occasionally scribbling on a legal pad. They all had one thing in common: none of them had been prepared for this, because no one expects a viral reckoning to begin mid-flight, especially not one that starts without yelling. The story had broken less than 2 hours ago. The clip of Susan Hartley being escorted off had reached 3.2 million views on X. Seat 2A was trending not only in the US, but in the UK and Canada. Comment threads filled with veterans, public officials, and former airline employees. I served 22 years in the Air Force. I know exactly what that woman endured. Sided. Shameful. And she kept her composure. I teach law. This case will be on my syllabus next semester. And then came the line no PR team could recover from. She never even raised her voice. The world raised it for her. Inside the terminal, a woman in a tan pantsuit held her phone out to a colleague. "You know who she is, right?" she whispered. "Federal judge. Evelyn Monroe. She oversaw the Simmons Securities fraud case, the one with the contractor bribery network." The Qadhi blinked. "That Monroe?" "Yes." "That Monroe." Silence. Then, "Someone's getting fired." "No," the woman corrected. "Someone's getting audited." Meanwhile, in the executive office of the airline's Chicago Regional HQ, CEO Matthew Klein stared at the headlines on the plasma screen. His phone vibrated every 10 seconds. Legal, press, board, government relations, everyone had an opinion. But only one person had authority, and she was still sitting in 2A. He turned to his head of communications. "What do we have?" Drafted an apology, not naming her yet, acknowledging the incident broadly, offering internal review. Matthew frowned. "Generic?" "Yes, sir." "Trash it. Start over." The room fell silent. "We're not handling a PR bump," he continued. "We're dealing with a judicially lagged federal official, on record stating she was displaced due to profiling. But we don't know if it was technically profiling," the legal officer said gently. Matthew shot him a look. "She had a valid seat, was removed based on appearance, and we have crew who've admitted it. That's not technical, that's textbook." He turned back to the screen. A still image of Evelyn sitting quietly, coat in lap, eyes steady. Caldy said, "We're going to need more than an apology." Back on the plane, Evelyn's phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a message from an unlisted number. From Office of the Chief Judge, 7th Circuit. "We've been briefed. FAA has escalated to Congressional Subcommittee. Do not comment. We stand behind you." She locked the screen. A few moments later, the curtain parted. David Larson, the same executive who had removed Susan Hartley, stepped into first class. He moved slowly, carefully. "Judge Monroe," he said, voice low. "We're ready to escort you out now, if you'd like. Security has secured the area. There are press people nearby. But we've arranged a private route if you prefer." Evelyn looked at him, measuring. "Is she still employed?" Larson hesitated. "Suspended pending investigation." "That's not an answer," she replied. He shifted slightly. "She will not be on another aircraft until the inquiry is complete. That's all I can guarantee today." Evelyn nodded once. "That'll do, for now." She stood. Larson stepped back, giving her space. Not just physically, but socially, as if he knew this was no longer about airline etiquette. This was about institutional respect. The walk down the jet bridge was silent. Iker. No cameras, no flash. But outside the gate, the presence of a story was undeniable. Passengers from other flights paused. A few turned, a few stared. And somewhere near the center of the terminal, a journalist whispered into a lapel mic, "She's coming. The judge is walking out now." "Yes, it's her." Evelyn didn't change pace, didn't cover her face. Shin smiled. She wasn't walking out as a victim. She wasn't walking out as a hero. She was walking out as herself. The same woman who had boarded, quiet and qualified, with a ticket that should have been enough. A child watched her pass and tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Is she famous?" The mother thought for a second, then replied, "No, baby. She's important." Outside the gate, a press aide from the Department of Transportation hit send on a statement titled, "Dignity in Transit, an unacceptable incident and an institutional response." It was vague, but it wasn't silent. And in times like these, even vague was better than nothing. In a coffee shop in D.C., an aide to a freshman congresswoman drafted a memo. Legislative inquiry. Should gate staff and flight crew receive mandatory bias recognition training? In a group chat of federal clerks, someone dropped a link and wrote, "She never raised her voice." And they heard it anyway. And in 2A, now empty, there remained only a folded napkin and the imprint of presence. A reminder that sometimes justice doesn't land with sirens. It arrives with posture and silence and a name that carries itself. The apartment was quiet, save for the low hum of a ceiling fan and the gentle clink of a spoon stirring a cup of tea. Evelyn Monroe sat at her father's dining table, still in the same clothes she'd worn on Flight 3117. Her coat lay folded over the back of the chair, her heels abandoned by the door. She hadn't changed yet, not because she was too tired, but because something in her still felt suspended, like the flight had never really ended. Across from her, Judge Robert Monroe, retired circuit judge, and her father, sat with his reading glasses perched halfway down his nose, a thin folder open in front of him. He wasn't reading, not really. He was watching her. "You haven't said much," he said finally, his voice a low gravel, equal parts wisdom and warning. "I didn't need to," she replied. He nodded. "That's not what I meant." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, the teacup warm in her hands. "It happened," she said simply. "People saw it. They reacted. It's in the headlines now." Her father folded the folder closed. "Headlines aren't justice." "No," she agreed. "But they're fuel." He watched her carefully. "You didn't call me when it happened." She smiled faintly. "You taught me not to." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I taught you to be precise. I didn't teach you to carry the whole world on your back alone." Evelyn looked at him. "You raised me to be the room, not wait to be welcomed into it. And that's exactly what you did," he said. "But I know that look. You're carrying more than just the story." She set the cup down gently. "I'm tired of being quiet and still being seen as a threat, of boarding with a valid ticket and being told I don't fit, of knowing that if I had raised my voice even one octave too high, the story would have been about my behavior instead of her judgment." Her father didn't interrupt. "And the worst part," she continued, "is that none of this surprised me." There was a pause, long enough for the old grandfather clock in the corner to tick through a full minute. Then, he said, "You were right not to yell." "I wasn't trying to be right," she replied. "I just didn't want to give them a headline they could twist." He nodded. "But what you gave them was better," he said. "You gave them a mirror." Evelyn looked down at her hands, steady, but tired. "I keep thinking about all the women who've been told to move and didn't have someone show up for them. No officer, no executive, no trending hashtag, just humiliation and silence." Robert leaned forward. You know what the real fear of people like that flight attendant is? What? That power might wear a face they didn't expect, that discipline might speak with the voice of a woman, that dignity might come dressed in a gray coat and shoes they don't recognize. Evelyn smiled faintly. You always did love a poetic finish. He smiled back. I'm old, I've earned the right. He reached into the folder and pulled out a printed memo. FAA seal, internal investigation update. Timeline, administrative hold. Probable termination. He handed it to her. They're offering you a written apology, he said, and they want to know if you'd consider meeting with the airline board privately. Evelyn took the paper but didn't read it right away. I'm not interested in handshakes behind doors. I figured, he said. She glanced at the memo, then folded it neatly. But I am interested in change. He nodded slowly. You thinking lawsuit? She shook her head. No, I want policy, procedures, mandatory ticket verification before displacement, bias protocol training, clear channels for passengers to report discrimination without being labeled disruptive. He tapped the table once, approvingly. And I want it public, she added. I want it documented, voted on, and adopted, not just in this airline but industry-wide. Her father looked impressed. You don't just want resolution, you want infrastructure. Exactly. They sat in silence for a moment. Then she asked, Did you ever experience anything like this? When you were still in robes? He laughed under his breath. Child, I had judges double-check my credentials in chambers. I had clerks call security when I entered through the wrong courthouse door. I once had a defendant's lawyer ask me if I was the court reporter. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Seriously? He nodded. Dead serious. I was 35, wearing a robe with a nameplate that said Judge Monroe. And still, I didn't fit the picture in their minds. Did you report it? No, he said. But I remember it. Then he added, You didn't report this either, not exactly. She held up her phone. I didn't have to, the system reported itself. They shared a smile, bittersweet in knowing. 2 generations of judges, 2 different eras. Same story, except this time the audience was listening. Later, as Evelyn stood by the window looking out at the Chicago skyline, her father approached quietly and placed a hand on her shoulder. You know they're going to ask you to speak. I know. Dittman stunned. They'll want a statement, TV, panels, conferences. The press will spin it 12 ways. She turned slightly toward him. I won't let them reduce it to sound bites. He nodded once. But I will speak, she said. His eyebrows lifted. Not just for me, but for every woman who sat in 2A and didn't make it home with her dignity intact. Outside, the city lights flickered, unaware. But inside that apartment, something had settled. A plan, a purpose, and a promise not to let this story disappear into the news cycle like just another trending topic. Evelyn Monroe wasn't asking for justice. She was building it, one policy at a time. The auditorium was modest, no grand marble columns, no chandeliers, just rows of folding chairs, a small riser with a wooden podium, and a single American flag standing quietly in the corner. But the room was full. Veterans in clean-pressed uniforms, community leaders in business casual, journalists with recorders on their laps. And in the front row, 2 elderly women sat shoulder to shoulder, holding hands. No one said it aloud, but they all felt it. Something meaningful was about to be said, finally, out loud. Judge Evelyn Monroe stood behind the curtain, her hands loosely clasped, shoulders straight. She wore no robe, no formal bench attire. Just a navy blazer, white blouse, and a soft gray scarf tucked into her collar. She didn't need to look powerful. She was powerful. The event was hosted by a local veterans advocacy group, but the topic had quickly grown beyond military service. What began as a quiet invitation for remarks had turned into a nationally live-streamed event. The story of Flight 3117 had reached Capitol Hill, and now even C-SPAN was watching. But Evelyn didn't care about the cameras. She hadn't come to impress anyone. She had come to clarify. The organizer tapped her gently on the shoulder. "They're ready for you, ma'am." She nodded once and walked onto the stage. The applause was soft at first, respectful, hesitant. People weren't sure how loud to be for someone who hadn't asked for attention, but had nonetheless drawn a nation's gaze. But by the time she reached the podium, the room had risen. She stood quietly as the last hands came together. Then she placed a single sheet of paper on the lectern. She didn't look down at it. She looked out, and she began. "I didn't come here to talk about airline policy. I didn't come to shame an employee or to punish a corporation. I'm not here to trend, and I don't need validation from strangers. What I need, what I want, is to say what I couldn't say in seat 2A. I sat quietly because I had to. Because if I'd raised my voice, the story might have become about me being angry rather than about what had happened. And what happened was simple. I was judged before I was welcomed. Asked for proof before I was offered decency. I was moved, not because I was disruptive or unqualified or disrespectful, but because someone assumed I didn't belong." She let the silence sit there, not rushed, not filled. Then she continued, voice calm, deliberate. "That assumption has followed me my entire life, through school, through law, through every courtroom I ever entered. It came in many forms. Are you the clerk? Are you lost? Is your husband the judge? But this time, it came 30,000 feet in the air, and for once, someone watched it happen. For once, I didn't have to write it in a footnote of a memoir 20 years later." This time the silence broke. People leaned in. Phones stayed down. No one wanted to miss a word. I've spent a career handing down decisions, but that day, I made a choice. Not to yell, not to explain myself to someone who had already made up their mind. I chose to let my name carry its own weight. I chose stillness, and the system responded, not because I demanded it, but because it had to. That tells you something, doesn't it? The system can work, but it only works when someone is watching. She looked around the room, paused again. "I'm not here to take victory laps. There are no winners in moments like this, just clarity." I didn't speak for applause. I spoke because I know what it feels like to be invisible while sitting in plain sight. And now that you've seen it, you don't get to unsee it. A quiet wave rolled through the room. It wasn't sound. It was understanding. "So, what comes next?" she asked. "Policy. I've submitted a proposal through the Department of Transportation. It includes mandatory bias training for all cabin crew, standardized ticket verification before displacement, and a real-time reporting mechanism for passengers who experience discrimination. Not after the flight. No more polite apologies. No more reassignments without accountability. We are done pretending misunderstanding means harmless." She lifted her sheet of paper but didn't read from it. To circle her rubber hand. "Some will say I'm being dramatic. That this was one flight. One seat. But ask yourself, how many times has it happened without a camera? Without a ranking badge? Without a title to fall back on? I don't want to be the exception that proves the rule. I want to help rewrite the rule." That's when the standing ovation began. Not for spectacle, but for resolve. Evelyn stepped back from the podium, gave a slight nod, and walked off stage without waiting for praise. Behind the curtain, The aide who greeted her earlier now looked stunned. "You didn't use a teleprompter." Evelyn smiled. "Didn't need one." Backstage, a journalist approached her gently. "Judge Monroe, do you have a minute for a quick quote?" Evelyn considered. Then she leaned in and said quietly, "I'm not here to be quoted, I'm here to be heard." That night, the speech aired on every major news outlet. A clip circulated with headlines like, "Judge who sat quietly in 2A now speaks loud enough for a nation." "Stillness is power. The woman who changed airline policy without raising her voice." But Evelyn didn't watch the coverage. She was already reviewing drafts of policy wording, already working with legal counsel, already fielding emails from federal transportation offices. And in a small coffee shop in Memphis, a retired school teacher named Margaret Ellis watched the full speech on her phone, tears running quietly down her cheeks. She whispered, "That's what it looks like when someone doesn't just get justice, but becomes it." If this story resonated with you, if you've ever sat in a seat you paid for and still felt unseen, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us, have you ever been made to feel like you didn't belong, even when you did everything right? Drop your story in the comments. You never know who might need to hear it today. And if you believe in justice, that doesn't need noise to be powerful. Subscribe and stay with us. Thank you for riding along with Evelyn's journey. Seat 2A may be quiet, but its echo travels far.